The first German officers to encounter America's aircraft carriers did not expect them to change the course of the war. They thought them too fragile, too reliant on planes that could be destroyed. But as these floating giants appeared on the horizon, they were forced to rethink their entire naval strategy. It was the early days of the Second World War, in the winter of 1942, when the Atlantic still held its strategic importance for both the Allies and Germany. German naval commanders, steeped in the tradition of battleships and submarines, did not yet grasp the immense power that America's aircraft carriers would bring to the battlefield. The U.S. Navy's warships, giant in size, equipped with vast air fleets, seemed a mere novelty to the German officers who viewed them as distant, fragile auxiliaries, not worthy of true military regard. But all that changed when reports began trickling into the German high command. U-boat commanders who had once struck convoys with impunity now found their prey constantly protected by invisible forces, aircraft launched from ships, scouting the ocean from miles away. The illusion of the sea as a place for submersible predation was shattered. The presence of the aircraft carrier had flipped the script on naval warfare. What the Germans had once viewed as mere speculation soon proved to be undeniable reality. The reality of these floating giants was only amplified when the German Navy's worst fears were confirmed in the Pacific. The Battle of Midway in June of 1942 saw American carriers decimate the Imperial Japanese Navy. What began as whispers became a nightmare. The carriers were no longer just part of the Allies' arsenal. They were now the heart of it. As the Germans learned about the scale, the production, and the extraordinary mobility of America's fleet, they realized they were facing something utterly alien. The days of giant battleships and submarines ruling the seas were numbered. The age of the aircraft carrier had arrived, and with it, a terrifyingly new reality. As the war moved into full swing, American aircraft carriers began to show their true potential, fundamentally altering the naval strategies employed by both the Allies and their enemies. The Axis powers, especially Germany, had long relied on the supremacy of their battleships and submarines. Yet, the introduction of the aircraft carrier, a vessel capable of deploying an entire air force, rewrote the rules of engagement at sea. By 1942, Germany's expectations had been shattered. At the heart of this realization were reports from both the Atlantic and the Pacific. In the Atlantic, German U-boat commanders, once the terror of convoys, now found themselves hunted. Aircraft, launched from these massive floating fortresses, patrolled the seas and drove U-boats into hiding. The strategic use of these carriers, especially their air cover, began to tilt the balance of naval power toward the Allies. Convoys that once sailed with no protection from the air now had constant surveillance, leaving the U-boats with few places to hide. For the Germans, the implications were profound. They had thought of naval power in terms of surface ships immense, heavily armed vessels like the Bismarck. Yet these American carriers, despite lacking the heavy guns of traditional battleships, could strike with far-reaching air attacks. The Bismarck's own loss to an airstrike at the hands of the Royal Navy in May of 1941 demonstrated the new vulnerability of even the most powerful warships. American carriers were becoming mobile airfields that could project power far beyond what had once been thought possible. In the Pacific, reports of the Battle of Midway further cemented the carrier's place as the new titan of naval warfare. The Japanese had relied on their battleships, yet it was the American carriers that would make the difference. The destruction of 4 Japanese carriers in a single battle, an unprecedented blow to their navy, was a stark reminder of the immense capabilities the Americans now wielded. What had once seemed like a novel, secondary weapon became the cornerstone of American naval strategy. The German officers, watching this unfold, could not help but feel a growing sense of dread. How could they, with their traditional naval tactics, ever match the reach and flexibility of a fleet so defined by air superiority? By the end of 1943, German intelligence reports were full of references to the Allies' carriers. For the first time, they understood that American carriers were more than just a strategic asset. They were the new backbone of the Allied war effort. The scale of the production, too, was an awakening. German factories, already struggling under Allied bombardment and resource shortages, could not keep pace with the American war machine. The U.S. was producing carriers faster than the Germans could build or repair their battleships. The shock was evident in every intercepted message. The psychological impact on German naval officers was palpable. How could they possibly face a navy that was not only larger but also more versatile, more mobile, and better supplied? The Americans had found a way to dominate the seas without relying solely on massive, fixed fortresses of steel. The introduction of carriers meant that no longer could any corner of the ocean be considered safe. The turning point in the battle for naval supremacy came in the Pacific, during the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. It was here that the true power of the American aircraft carriers was revealed to the world, and most importantly, to the German officers monitoring the conflict. This battle was a microcosm of the shift in naval warfare, a shift that Germany had underestimated. At Midway, the American fleet, though outnumbered and with the element of surprise on their side, demonstrated that their carriers could strike with precision, devastating Japanese forces before they even had a chance to retaliate. The Japanese had relied heavily on battleships and cruisers, just as Germany did, believing these massive ships would be the key to victory. But the Americans had shown that it was the aircraft, launched from carriers, that could deliver the final blow. German naval officers could hardly believe the reports coming from Midway. They were accustomed to battleships exchanging fire and submarines stalking convoys. Now, the concept of an airstrike from a moving platform thousands of miles from land was an entirely new paradigm. American dive bombers, fighters, and torpedo bombers decimated the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 of their carriers in a matter of hours. To German minds, this was almost incomprehensible. The Battle of Midway wasn't just a defeat for Japan, it was a warning to Germany, underscoring the vulnerability of the surface fleet they had relied on for so long. In the wake of this defeat, the Japanese Navy, much like the German Navy, was forced to confront the reality that aircraft carriers were no longer auxiliary support vessels, but the backbone of modern naval warfare. And the Germans were now faced with the looming threat that these floating cities of war could dominate the seas, no matter where the battle was fought. The consequences of this shift were profound. While the Germans had developed advanced technologies, such as the U-boat, they had failed to adapt to this new form of warfare. The psychological impact was overwhelming. How could you fight an enemy that had effectively rendered your naval doctrines obsolete? For American forces, the victory at Midway was a pivotal moment. The carriers were no longer seen as a novelty but as an essential force that could project power over vast distances. For the German officers watching the developments unfold, it was the ultimate wake-up call. They were witnessing the birth of the NNA, a new age of naval warfare, and they were not prepared for it. As the Pacific War progressed, the impact of American aircraft carriers continued to shake the very foundations of naval strategy. While the Japanese struggled to recover from the loss at Midway, the Allies seized the opportunity to advance, taking the fight directly to Japan's doorstep. The carriers were the spearhead of these campaigns, supporting amphibious landings, interdicting Japanese supply lines, and providing unmatched air cover for American forces. The scale of this new kind of warfare was staggering. No longer confined to the limitations of land-based airfields, American aircraft could strike at any location with surgical precision. The concept of island hopping was born, and it relied heavily on the constant presence of aircraft carriers able to provide air support for each new conquest. These massive ships allowed the Americans to project their power wherever they chose, an advantage that Germany simply could not match. As the war reached its crescendo in the Pacific, German officers continued to observe the growing American dominance in naval warfare. They knew their own navy could not compete with the sheer might and versatility of the U.S. carriers. While Germany had invested heavily in battleships and U-boats, the carriers demonstrated the supremacy of mobility, flexibility, and sustained air power. The Germans' frustration was palpable. How could they hope to overcome an enemy whose naval forces could reach from one island to another, with each carrier functioning as an autonomous airfield, capable of launching hundreds of sorties a day? The psychological impact on German commanders was profound. The tactics they had relied on, honed over years of warfare, seemed increasingly inadequate. The carriers had redefined the very nature of naval combat. As the war continued, Germany's naval leadership began to realize that they had misjudged the future of naval warfare. The battleships and U-boats they had relied on were relics of a bygone era, unable to match the speed and devastating power of American aircraft carriers. For the Allies, the use of carriers in the Pacific would soon culminate in one of the most decisive victories of the war, the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944. The Japanese Navy, now shattered and disorganized, was unable to stop the relentless march of American forces, supported by the overwhelming power of the aircraft carriers. The victory signaled the near-total collapse of Japanese naval power, a result that seemed inevitable when viewed in hindsight, but was the direct consequence of the innovation that Germany had failed to grasp. The era of the aircraft carrier was here to stay. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the final blow to the Japanese Navy, but it also marked the beginning of a new era in naval warfare, one in which the aircraft carrier reigned supreme. By the end of the war, American carriers had fundamentally transformed the way naval battles were fought. They had shifted the focus from heavy battleships and submarines to the flexibility and mobility of air power, proving to the world that the future of naval warfare belonged to the skies. For the German officers who had once dismissed aircraft carriers as a passing novelty, the war's conclusion offered a harsh lesson. As they reflected on the course of the conflict, they acknowledged the strategic brilliance of the American carriers and the devastating impact they had on the balance of power at sea. The floating cities that had once seemed like a fantastical concept were now reality, reshaping not only the naval battlefield, but also the very nature of global warfare. In post-war memoirs, many German naval officers admitted that they had underestimated the true potential of the American carriers. Some even confessed that had Germany built its own fleet of such vessels, the course of the war might have been very different. But by the time the realization came, it was too late. America had already established its dominance at sea, and no amount of strategy could change the outcome. The legacy of the American aircraft carriers extended far beyond the waters of the Pacific. They were a symbol of the United States' industrial capacity, a testament to the power of American ingenuity, and a reminder of how quickly technological advances could shift the balance of power. The carriers also stood as a stark contrast to the declining Reich, which had squandered its resources on outdated naval doctrines. Even after the war, the impact of these floating cities continued to reverberate. As the Cold War unfolded, the American Navy, supported by its fleet of aircraft carriers, became the dominant force on the world stage. The strategic use of carriers, their ability to project power across the globe, and their ability to sustain long-term operations far from home would shape military doctrines for decades to come. For Germany, the rise of the aircraft carrier marked a profound shift in naval warfare, one that the Kriegsmarine would never be able to match. It was a reminder of their failure to adapt to the changing tides of war. In the end, it wasn't just about the size of the ships or the guns they carried. It was about the ability to project power across the vast expanses of the world's oceans. The American aircraft carriers, those floating cities, had redefined the battlefield, and as the post-war world unfolded, they stood as a testament to the unstoppable momentum of industrial might and technological innovation. The floating cities of war were not simply vessels, they were symbols of the future. A future where the balance of power could be shifted not by brute force, but by the ingenuity of those willing to embrace the new world of warfare.